Welcome to a deep dive. We're pulling back the curtain today on a really foundational text in Arnold Schoenberg's Fundamentals of Musical Composition.
Yeah, it's a big one.
If you've ever wondered, how composers take these raw musical ideas and actually build them into coherent, compelling pieces, well, this book is kind of like the master's blueprint.
That's a good way to put it. And the source material we're digging into, it comes straight from excerpts of Schoenberg's own writing. It really distills his years of teaching,
Right.
laying out this systematic way to think about how music's put together, starting really small.
Exactly. So our mission today basically is to unpack this system. We'll start almost microscopic, looking at the absolute basic building blocks, the phrase and the motive, and kind of zoom out to see how those build into simple themes. And finally touch on how these principles scale up into the architecture of much larger musical forms.
And, you really don't need to be a composer yourself to get a ton out of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Understanding these fundamental principles can profoundly change how you listen to music. You start to appreciate the incredible craft, the intentionality behind it all.
Let's unpack this then, starting with Schoenberg's core idea of form itself. He has this really fascinating perspective. He sees musical form less like a rigid container, more like a living organism.
Yes, that organism analogy is absolutely key for him. He stresses that for music to be comprehensible, it needs logic, it needs coherence, it just needs to make sense to the listener.
Right.
And like an organism, it's built bit by bit, cells forming tissues, tissues forming organs, but ideally the composer has a sense of the whole thing, the finished creature, right from the start.
That makes so much sense. You have the vision, but the actual creation is, incremental. And the smallest of those increments he talks about, the musical molecule, I think you call it.
Precisely. The phrase. Schoenberg presents it as the smallest structural unit. That little musical thought that feels like it has a definite ending, a point of arrival somehow.
Like punctuation.
Exactly like musical punctuation, maybe a comma, maybe a semicolon. And in, simpler music, you'll often find these phrases are maybe 2, 3, or 4 measures long. Pretty short.
And lurking within that phrase, or maybe even forming it, is an even more fundamental element. The motive. This feels like the real genetic code of the piece.
It absolutely is the DNA. The motive is the basic element, the thing that gives a piece its sense of unity, its relatedness, its coherence. Schoenberg actually calls it the greatest common factor running through the music.
Greatest common factor, I like that.
And it's primarily defined by its distinct rhythmic and melodic shape, its contour. Even a short phrase is usually built on the, conscious or sometimes unconscious use and treatment of one or more of these motives.
Okay, so you've got this little distinctive musical fingerprint, the motive. How on earth do composers take that tiny idea and make an entire piece out of it without just, hammering it into the listener's ear? Is it just repetition?
Well, repetition is the starting point, definitely.
Yeah.
But repetition alone gets tedious very quickly.
Right.
Schoenberg's really profound insight here is this concept of developing variation. This is kind of where the magic happens. The variations aren't just random changes. They feel like natural consequences, like elaborations or growth that stem directly from the original motive.
Developing variation. Okay, that sounds like a really key phrase. So the core challenge for a composer is making things new, but still recognizably familiar. How does Schoenberg suggest they, achieve that balance with the motive?
Oh, there are countless ways. You can change the rhythm, you could alter the intervals between the notes, shift the harmony it's played with, or change the melodic contour itself.
So lots of options.
Tons. You can rearrange notes, you can leave some out, add new ones in, or just tweak the rhythmic patterns. The goal is this constant transformation that still retains a recognizable link back to the original idea. It's kind of like seeing different members of the same family. They look different, but you can still see the resemblance.
That's a great analogy. And these related versions, these family members of the motive, are what you then chain together to build those musical sentences, the phrases.
Exactly right. Phrases are constructed by connecting these varied motive forms. The artistry and the logic, they come from using shared content, rhythmic similarities, coherent harmony, all to link them smoothly. In essence, you could say every piece of music, in a general sense, is a chain of phrases, each building on or transforming that basic motivic idea to some degree.
Okay, so we've got these tiny musical DNA strands, the motives building into short musical sentences, the phrases. Now, how does Schoenberg show us composers take those sentences and build bigger musical paragraphs? The actual themes you really hear in a piece.
Right. So Schoenberg explains how phrases combine to create larger units. The most common ones he discusses are the sentence and the period.
Okay.
And in simpler compositions, these often stretch out to maybe 8 or 16 measures.
Let's look at the period first. What's its typical structure look like?
The classic period is usually built from 2 phrases, often 4 measures each, giving you that 8-measure structure. He calls these the antecedent and the consequent phrases.
Antecedent and consequent. Okay.
Think of it like a musical question and answer. The antecedent phrase, the first one, often ends on a weaker, less final sounding point. Schoenberg would say, on a weaker cadence, often on the dominant chord, the V chord.
Right, the V chord, like the music is hanging, sort of waiting for something.
Exactly that feeling. And the consequent phrase, the second one, provides some contrast maybe, but crucially, it relates back to the antecedent and ends on a stronger, much more conclusive cadence, typically a perfect cadence on the tonic, the I chord.
The home base.
That's your home base chord. So you get that really satisfying feeling of arrival, answering the question posed by the first phrase.
Okay, that makes sense. Question and answer. And the sentence structure, that's different from this pattern.
It is, yeah. The sentence structure typically begins with a very clear presentation of the basic motive, often immediately repeated or slightly varied.
Okay, start strong.
Right. And this is followed by a section that feels more dynamic, more like a build-up or even a mini development driving towards a final cadence. Schoenberg specifically views the sentence structure itself as a kind of development because it starts working with and developing that initial idea almost immediately.
Development happening right there within the theme itself. That's a really interesting way to see it.
And he uses a specific term for how the sentence section wraps up, doesn't he? Something about liquidation.
Yes, liquidation. It's a fascinating technique, and you see it in sentences and also in larger forms later on. As you approach the cadence, the end of the sentence, the composer deliberately starts to, reduce or blur the distinctiveness of the motivic material. They might strip away characteristic features, make it less memorable, less defined.
Wait, why would you do that? Doesn't the motive give the music its identity? Why make it less distinct?
It does give it identity, absolutely. But liquidation serves a really crucial purpose. It helps focus the listener's ear entirely on the final harmonic conclusion, the cadence itself.
If the motive is still shouting for attention right up to the very last second, it can actually distract from that essential moment of musical resolution. Liquidation kind of clears the path for the harmony to land decisively. It feels counterintuitive at first, maybe, but it's incredibly effective for creating a sense of finality within the theme.
That's a real aha moment right there. Wow. It makes you think about why a composer might deliberately make something less interesting for a moment just to make the ending more powerful. And this book, it uses a lot of examples from famous pieces to show these structures, right?
Oh, it's absolutely packed with them. Schoenberg heavily illustrates all these principles using actual music from the master composers. Beethoven's piano sonatas are a frequent go-to for him.
Yeah, I bet.
But he also draws really widely on Mozart, Haydn, Brahms, Schubert, many others, showing how these underlying structures manifest in their very unique styles.
Okay, moving beyond just the main melody line then, what about the accompaniment? Is that just background noise?
Yeah.
Wallpaper?
Absolutely not. Schoenberg is really clear that the accompaniment is an essential, integral part of the composition, not just some background filler.
Yep.
It has to complement the main musical idea, contributing significantly to the overall harmony, the rhythm, and importantly, the character of the piece. It can range from, simple block chords like in a chorale to complex moving lines, figuration, but good voice leading and a strong, coherent bass line underneath are always critical for an effective accompaniment.
So all these ingredients, the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, the way the accompaniment is shaped, they all work together to create the overall character and mood of a piece.
Precisely. Musical elements don't just exist as abstract sounds. They evoke associations and feelings. They create character and mood. The tempo, the rhythm, the harmony, the melody's actual shape, the nature of the accompaniment, it all contributes. Think about old dance forms like a stately minuet or a lively gavotte or maybe a yearning mazurka.
Right.
Their characteristic patterns immediately suggest a particular feeling or scene.
And there's a distinction Schoenberg makes between melody and theme, which I found interesting. They're not quite the same thing for him.
Yes, he clarifies that. Melody is the specific line itself, its contour, its pitches, its rhythm. Pretty straightforward. The theme, however, is a larger structural concept for him. It's the complete musical unit, like a period or a sentence we just discussed, that incorporates the melody but also includes its specific harmony, its rhythm, and its accompaniment.
The whole package.
The whole package. And while melodies meant for singing often need to be easily singable, fit the voice well, instrumental melodies have much more freedom in their shape, their leaps, their range, but the theme is always that whole structured idea built around that melodic line.
Okay, right. So we've broken down the building blocks and seen how they form these simple themes. Schoenberg's book then sort of hints at how these principles scale up to larger musical forms. What are some of the fundamental ones he introduces?
He covers several key forms.
Yeah.
Among the smaller ones, the small ternary form is really fundamental. That's the classic ABA structure.
ABA prime.
Got it.
You have a section A, then a contrasting section B, followed by a return, often varied slightly, of the first section A. The minuet and scherzo movements you find in symphonies and sonatas are classic examples of this ternary ABA form.
And are musical structures always perfectly balanced, like those neat 4-measure phrases or 8-measure periods we talked about? Or does it get messy?
While symmetrical construction is definitely very common, especially back in the classical era, Schoenberg absolutely discusses how composers use what he calls uneven, irregular, and asymmetrical construction.
Okay.
You'll find plenty of pieces, particularly maybe from the Romantic period onwards, that use phrases or sections with irregular numbers of measures, 5 measures, 7 measures.
Yeah.
It adds flexibility and can create different kinds of tension or flow. It's not always neat boxes.
What about forms built around changing an initial idea over and over?
That brings us to the theme and variations form. Here you start with a complete theme, usually fairly simple, and then the composer creates a whole series of variations based on it.
Each variation modifies different elements of the original theme. Maybe they'll change the melody slightly or alter the rhythm drastically, change the harmony underneath, shift the whole character, or even completely transform the accompaniment style. But they always keep some core connection to the original theme recognizable somehow.
And then there are the really large-scale forms, the ones you find in major works like symphonies or sonatas.
Right. The book gives an overview of the components within those larger forms, too. Things like transition sections that smoothly move between different musical ideas.
Bridges, basically.
Bridges, exactly. And subordinate themes that offer contrast to the main opening theme. And then the coda, which is the concluding section that wraps everything up at the very end.
And the big forms themselves.
He introduces major large forms like the rondo form, which is characterized by a recurring main theme coming back again and again.
Like ABACA.
Something like that, yes. And most significantly, the sonata allegro form, often just called first movement form, this is the big one, really central to Western classical music, with its distinct sections. The exposition, where the main ideas are introduced.
Okay.
The development, where those ideas are explored, broken down, recombined, really worked with.
The messy bit.
The messy, exciting bit. And finally, the recapitulation, which brings the original ideas back, usually resolving any tension that was built up.
Exposition, development, recapitulation. Got it. Yep. It's a dense but incredibly logical system he lays out here.
Yeah.
Beyond just describing the structures, what kind of practical advice does Schoenberg offer the aspiring composer in this book?
Right.
Or maybe just the curious listener?
Well, a central theme throughout is the absolute importance of self-criticism. He hammers this home.
Tough love.
Definitely. He gives several really practical points. First, immerse yourself in music, listen to it constantly, play it repeatedly if you can. Analyze the pieces you study to understand how they work at a fundamental level, not just what they sound like.
Really dig in.
Dig deep. Learn to identify and then eliminate the non-essential in your own writing. Be concise. Actively work to avoid monotony through thoughtful variation, not just mindless repetition. Make sketches, try out ideas on paper before committing, and pay rigorous attention to harmony and especially the bass line. He really stresses their foundational role in guiding the music forward.
That sounds like phenomenal advice, honestly, not just for someone writing music, but for becoming a much more engaged and perceptive listener too.
Absolutely. I think so too. By applying that kind of analytical ear, thinking about those motives, those phrases, the way themes are built and sometimes liquidated, you can really start to hear music on a much deeper level. You start to hear the choices the composer made.
Yeah, the intentionality.
Exactly.
So we've taken a pretty deep dive here into Schoenberg's fundamentals, exploring His systematic breakdown of musical composition from the tiniest motive, that musical DNA, how those build into complete phrases, how phrases combine into structured themes like the period in the sentence, using techniques like developing variation and that fascinating liquidation idea.
Right.
And finally touching on how these same ideas underpin the architecture of much larger forms like sonata form.
It truly reveals the intellectual rigor and the incredible craft that goes into creating music that feels not just beautiful or emotional, but coherent, logical, and deeply expressive.
Yeah.
It shows that even the most seemingly spontaneous passages often have a powerful, intentional blueprint underneath them.
It really does give you a new appreciation for the composer's art. It's not just magic, it's construction. So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. How does knowing about these underlying rules and structures of composition, this detailed blueprint Schoenberg lays out, how does that change the way you listen to music? Does it enhance the magic you hear, or does it maybe make you focus more on the scaffolding than the finished? Something to think about.